Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the smoky, chaotic heart of a medieval kitchen. Not a royal one, mind you, no silver platters or peacocks stuffed with other birds. No, this is the back room of a rural inn or a modest manor, where the ceilings drip with grease, the hearth spits ash, and the dog's probably smarter than the cook's apprentice. You can almost hear the pop of boiling broth and smell the scorched crust clinging to a battered iron pot. We're going to talk about what people actually ate in the days before tomatoes, before potatoes, and long before cheese came in neat slices. And let me warn you, if you think you'd thrive in this time period because you once made sourdough during lockdown, you wouldn't last a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck through a low doorway, your head narrowly missing a beam thick with soot. The kitchen greets you with heat, not warmth, the kind of smothering air that clings to your skin and turns your tunic into a damp rag. A fire's roaring in the stone hearth, and a bent iron hook suspends a pot of something vaguely edible over the embers. This, you're told, is dinner. In medieval kitchens, bread was the centre of everything. Not the fluffy kind you pick up from a bakery aisle, but dense, hard loaves often baked once a week and designed to survive siege or famine. If it crumbled, it was too soft. If it cut your gums, perfect. You're handed a piece, heavy as a brick, with the texture of week-old cornbread left on a windowsill. It's meant to be dipped, not chewed directly, unless you're hoping to lose a molar. They called it trencher bread. In fact, it was the plate. Meals were served on slabs of bread, and once the stew had soaked in enough to soften it, or after a noble had eaten the good parts, the trencher might be tossed to the servants, the dogs, or the poor waiting outside. Recycling, medieval style. The pot hanging above the fire smells like broth, light, oily, and suspiciously thin. A few turnips bob at the surface, their skins wrinkled and pale like tired toes. Broth was the lifeline of most medieval kitchens. Bones boiled with onions, sometimes carrots if you were lucky, and maybe a hint of barley. Think of it as soup's tired cousin who never really had ambition. And yet, this was luxury for some. For peasants, that same broth might be recycled from day to day, with bits added here and there. Bread was soaked in it, old meat reboiled, herbs thrown in to mask whatever had started to turn. There was even a superstition that boiling the same broth for 9 days made it stronger. In reality, it made it more creative. The cook, a red-faced man with a scar under one eye and the eternal expression of someone trying to remember what day it is, waves a wooden spoon. Taste, he offers. You hesitate, but curiosity or peer pressure wins. The liquid burns slightly on your tongue, not from heat but from acidity. Vinegar, you realize, used to revive old flavors, or kill new bacteria, or both. Either way, it numbs the taste of the spoiled fat floating on top. You retreat to a bench, watching as bread is sliced with a knife, so dull it's more of a persuasion than a cut. In some kitchens, the bread was made not just of wheat or rye, but with filler, ground peas, chaff, even bark in lean years. Bark. You remember that the next time someone complains about gluten-free options, what surprises you most is the rhythm of it all. Despite the chaos, the coughing chimney, and the clatter of spoons, there's a system, a hierarchy. The youngest boy chops onions, slowly and tearfully, while an older woman tends a second pot with a gentleness that hints at pride. Her stew smells better. Not great, but better. She has, you learn, a secret. A pinch of dried thyme she hides in her apron. It's her magic, her rebellion. There's a small altar in the corner of the room. A wooden cross, a dish of salt. Superstition and seasoning sat side by side. Salt was currency, both literal and symbolic. To spill it meant bad luck. To waste it was a sin. And to cook without it was, well, sadly common. It was expensive, and many stews tasted more like wet cardboard because of it. You glance up and notice something odd. Hooks hanging from beams. Dried herbs? Sure. but also fish skeletons, bunches of garlic, and one sad-looking animal foot. Not for decoration, for flavour or ritual, or possibly just forgotten. Some historians still debate what certain kitchen charms were for. To ward off pests, to protect the cook, or maybe just to keep the apprentices from snacking. And so you sit. The heat presses in, the smells blur, the bread gets softer as it soaks. And you start to understand that food here wasn't about indulgence. It was survival, creativity, and making the best of what little you had. And frankly, even if you were starving, you'd probably still think twice before biting into bark bread soaked in vinegar broth. But then again, you're not medieval. You have a microwave. They didn't even have a clean spoon. The door to the root cellar groans as you tug it open. Cold air rushes past your ankles, sharp with the scent of damp earth and old vegetables. You step carefully down the uneven stone stairs, lantern in hand, your breath fogging slightly as you descend. This is the medieval refrigerator, a deep, dark hole in the ground where sunlight doesn't intrude, and where everything either survives the winter, or becomes an experiment in what shouldn't have been stored beside turnips. Shelves line the walls, stacked with baskets of root crops, carrots with hair-like sprouts, parsnips shaped like claws, and beets so shriveled they resemble ancient knuckles. Most of them are fine, in a loose sense of the word. But you pick one up, give it a sniff, and immediately regret it. Back then, storing food was half knowledge, half prayer. Without refrigeration, medieval cooks relied on cool air, salt, smoke, and a whole lot of hope. Root cellars, like the one you're in now, were common in rural homes. They were essential for surviving long winters, famine, or a failed harvest. Unfortunately, no matter how careful they were, things rotted. And often people didn't find out until it was too late, or until that weird smell finally convinced someone to look. A boy scurries in behind you, arms full of burlap sacks. He's humming, terribly off-key, and drops the bags near a pile of onions before skittering away again like he's afraid the cabbage might be contagious. You hear a thump, probably a rat, or something worse. You decide not to investigate. In one corner you spot apples wrapped in straw, carefully spaced to keep them from bruising. Fruit especially was a luxury to preserve. It could be dried, stewed, or turned into a thick paste and sealed with beeswax. Some families layered sliced apples between hay, hoping they'd last until spring. Others boiled the fruit down with honey and hoped no mold would bloom in the crock. Spoiler alert, it usually did. Some of the most creative food storage came from necessity. A medieval cook might bury smoked meats in ash or store grains in clay pots sealed with animal fat. Did it always work? No. Did it sometimes result in something vaguely edible? Sometimes. Did people eat it anyway? Absolutely. One particularly odd container catches your eye, an old ceramic jar sealed with cloth and beeswax. The cook tells you it holds pickled gooseberries. You ask if they're good. She shrugs. Better than nothing, she says, which, in this time, is often the highest praise food can earn. You sit down on an overturned bucket, watching condensation bead on the stone walls. Even in the cold, the smell of turnip rot lingers, slightly sweet and disturbingly sour. You wonder how they judged freshness. Apparently, if it didn't move or hiss, it was fair game. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, beets, onions, and turnips were the backbone of medieval cuisine. Hardy, filling, and relatively easy to store, they made up the bulk of stews and pottages. The word pottage comes up a lot here. It basically meant whatever's left, boiled until soft. There were no measurements, just a bubbling pot, a handful of this, a pinch of that, and a whispered apology to your digestive system. And don't think these dishes tasted the same every time. With no consistent ingredients, no two pots were ever alike. One day's pottage might be hearty and savoury. The next, a watery nightmare with notes of onion and regret. Interestingly, some households experimented with preservation by smoking root vegetables over peat fires. It gave them a distinct, almost peaty flavour, like eating a carrot soaked in fireplace ash. Not recommended, but hey, it was an early attempt at gourmet. And let's not forget, food wasn't just stored in cellars. Some was buried in snowbanks, others were hung from rafters. There are even accounts of villagers digging holes in their courtyards, lining them with straw, and hiding potatoes inside. Of course, potatoes didn't show up in Europe until the 16th century, so unless you had a time machine, it was just turnips. Again. Always turnips. Some historians still debate whether specific cellar techniques were borrowed from older Roman methods, or developed independently in different regions. What's clear is that by the time the 13th century rolled around, every halfway functional kitchen had a cellar, or wished it did. You notice now that some of the vegetables down here have been peeled, chopped and dried. These are the cook's secret weapons, sun-dried roots that could be dropped into stew months later. Sure, they lost flavour. Sure, they turned rubbery. But if it filled a belly and didn't kill you, success. There's a moment of silence as you sit in the dim, listening to water drip slowly from the ceiling. The vegetables lie like sleeping beasts in the dark, holding their breath until someone needs them. And eventually, someone always does. Back upstairs, you lean over the bubbling pot again, and this time something's different. The scent is tangier, sharper, with a sour edge that makes your nose wrinkle before your brain catches up. The cook ladles a small portion into a wooden bowl and gestures for you to try. It's stew again, but not the rich, tomato-laced kind you might expect. There are no tomatoes here, not yet. What you're about to eat is what people once called sour pottage. The name doesn't lie, it's pottage, and it's very, very sour. Vinegar has been poured in, along with the juice from pickled vegetables and perhaps a squeeze of sour apple pulp, if any was still around from the root cellar. The goal wasn't to make it taste delicious, it was to make it safe. In an age before refrigeration, vinegar was a kind of culinary armour. Before tomatoes made their European debut, medieval cooks leaned on what they had: acids from sour fruit, fermented cabbage water, or even verjuice, the juice of unripe grapes. These things lent dishes a puckering tartness, enough to distract from any, shall we say, aging flavours in the meat or broth. You chew cautiously. The stew is warm and vaguely slimy, with soft chunks of root vegetables and what might be barley. It tastes like disappointment marinated in pickled onions. But the villagers are smiling as they eat. To them, this is comfort food. It's warm, filling, and proof that they've made it through another day. The lack of tomatoes in medieval Europe is something we rarely think about. Tomatoes are so embedded in modern cuisine, sauces, soups, pizza, pasta, that imagining life without them feels incomplete. But they only arrived in Europe after the Columbian Exchange, sometime in the 16th century. And even then, they were treated with suspicion. Some believed they were poisonous. Others grew them only as ornamental plants, their bright red fruit too beautiful to trust. So how did people make do without tomatoes? With creativity and a dash of desperation. Cooks used fruit like plums or green apples to bring brightness to their dishes. They'd mash sour berries or wild grapes into stews. Even fermented dairy, like sour milk or curd, was used to give a tangy contrast to bland grains or tough meats. In wealthier kitchens, a chef might reach for verjuice, a prized ingredient made from crab apples or unripe grapes. It had a soft acidity, somewhere between lemon juice and mild vinegar. Some medieval recipes even advised boiling fish in it, because nothing says luxury like tart poached eel. But in places like this, your average village kitchen, the tools were humble. Fermentation was the default. Sour cabbage, pickled onions, vinegar-soaked turnips. Even the bread might carry a tang from a wild yeast starter, passed down through generations. Some families protected their sourdough starter like it was an heirloom, or at least more valuable than a second child. You glance over at a clay pot sitting near the hearth. It's filled with something pale and murky, and when you ask, the cook tells you it's sour porridge, barley left to soak for days, then heated and salted. A bit of pig fat is stirred in for flavour, though it mostly just coats your tongue like candle wax. And still, everyone eats. No one complains. In a world where you couldn't just swing by a market or pop open a jar, these tart, preserved flavours were essential. They brightened bland grains, masked odd smells, and most importantly kept people alive. The apprentice is humming again, this time while chopping pickled beets. He's missing a front tooth and keeps licking the vinegar from his fingers. You ask if he likes the taste. He grins. better than spoiled stew. That's the benchmark here, not flavour, but safety. Some food historians argue that this era developed its own flavour palette, built entirely around necessity. Sourness became synonymous with preservation, and in many ways, with survival. Even when tomatoes finally arrived centuries later, cooks still leaned on vinegar and sour notes, out of habit, out of tradition, and perhaps because they'd grown to love the taste. There's a pause in the kitchen now. The pot has settled into a soft simmer, and the crackling fire offers a comforting background. You sit back and close your eyes for a moment, imagining a time when every bite was a risk, a memory, and a small triumph rolled into one. And as you drift into that haze of vinegar steam and barley breath, you realise you kind of miss the tomatoes. You're sitting on a low wooden stool now, watching the prep table get wiped. Well, more like brushed, clean with a rag that's probably older than the apprentice using it. The table is stained with years of effort. A notch here from a slipped knife, a dark patch there from beet juice, and something sticky that no one's bothered to investigate. In the centre of it all sits the true hero of the medieval kitchen. Not garlic, not grain. The onion. You wouldn't think it, but this humble bulb held empires together, culinarily speaking. It's the base of every broth, the companion to nearly every vegetable, and the one thing that could make an otherwise miserable stew taste slightly less like boiled regret. The cook slices one now, eyes watering but determined. It's an art. No dicing, no chef's knife gymnastics. Just steady, practiced hands, and a blade that's seen better centuries. The layers fall apart like paper, curling slightly at the edges. You notice the smell instantly, sharp, familiar, and oddly comforting. Onions were the backbone of medieval flavour. Grown easily, stored well, and full of bite, they were used in nearly everything. Raw, they added punch to bread and cheese. Cooked, they sweetened broths and disguised the off notes of questionable meat. In short, if it didn't start with an onion, it probably wasn't worth making. But it wasn't just onions. Their cousins, leeks, scallions, chives, and shallots were equally beloved. You'd find them in gardens, markets, and even poking out of roof thatch where seeds had taken hold. That's not a joke. Roof gardens were a thing, especially in cramped towns. So technically your dinner might have started above your head. A bowl is passed to you, onion soup, or something adjacent. It's more like onion water, but warm and smoky, with a slick of grease on top from the scrap of lard used in cooking. You take a sip, it's not bad, especially if you close your eyes and pretend it's French onion soup, minus the bread, the cheese, the rich broth, and the caramelization. So basically it's just onions. Still, this dish is a staple. It's been around since before cookbooks were even a thing. And while medieval cooks didn't always write things down, oral tradition was strong. Recipes passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from village elder to wide-eyed apprentice. Sometimes they were written in verse, like culinary lullabies. Boil the leeks till they sigh, add the bread lest it die. That kind of thing. Some of the older cooks believed onions had medicinal powers too. Mixed with honey, they were used to treat coughs. Sliced and placed on the soles of the feet, they were thought to draw out fevers. And of course, eaten raw, they supposedly protected against the plague. Of course, they also protected your social life by ensuring no one stood too close. One basket at the far end of the table contains dried onion skins, saved for dye. That's right. Onions weren't just food, they were fabric dye, poultices, pest repellents, and offerings left at shrines. Some households even hung them in bundles over doorways, believing they kept away evil spirits. If nothing else, they kept away guests who disliked strong smells. You're handed a small tart. It's filled with cooked onion and bits of curdled cheese. The crust crumbles in your fingers, and the filling is sweet, almost jammy. For a moment your taste buds remember something close to quiche, and then a faint bitterness kicks in, possibly because the onions were aged just a touch too long. Or maybe they've started fermenting. It's hard to say. Some medieval texts reference onion pies made with wine and spices, rare indulgences served at feasts. These were the kind of dishes that might make a guest lean back and groan with delight, or indigestion. The line was blurry. Interestingly, historians still argue about whether medieval onions were more pungent or milder than modern varieties. Some say they were smaller and wilder, packed with intense sulfur compounds. Others believe long cultivation had already softened their flavour. But all agree on one thing: onions were essential. You watch as the cook carefully wraps a few bulbs in linen and tucks them into a wooden crate. These will go into storage, layered with straw and ash to keep them cool. If all goes well, they'll last until spring. If not, well, at least they'll make the cellar smell like someone tried. The kitchen hums with movement again. More slicing, more stirring, more occasional swearing when someone drops a ladle into the fire. But beneath it all, the scent of onion persists, sweet, sharp, and oddly nostalgic. It clings to your clothes, it lives in your hair. And later tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll probably still be able to taste it. Not unpleasant, just persistent. You shift your seat slightly, careful not to tip the bench as someone plunks down beside you. A weathered man in a stained apron, carrying what looks like half a goose. He drops the bird with a thud on the chopping block, mutters something about being lucky today, and begins hacking away with a cleaver that has definitely seen more bones than wood. Meat in this kitchen is rare, and precious, and just a little unnerving. Most medieval meals didn't include meat, not because people were vegetarians by choice, but because animals were assets. Chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk, and pigs were a walking food bank. To slaughter an animal was a serious decision, one that usually came only when the animal was sick, old, or it was a feast day. Or, as is sometimes the case, when it had already died and there were no witnesses. You watch as the cook strips what little meat there is from the bone. Nothing is wasted. The skin will be crisped, the fat rendered, the bones boiled into broth, and the organs, well, those are considered a delicacy, even if you personally are still recovering from the sight of raw kidneys being diced with the same knife used to cut turnips earlier. The chunk of goose is tossed into the pot with a reverent splash. Immediately the smell changes, richer, deeper, with a layer of oil curling on the surface like a halo. Everyone in the room notices. Even the dog, previously asleep under the table, lifts its head in hope. You reach for a small bowl of yesterday's broth, where a scrap of salted pork floats like a bloated survivor from a shipwreck. Meat was often preserved in brine, or smoked until it resembled jerky, then added sparingly to stews. It wasn't the centerpiece, it was the accent. Like perfume, but chewable. Interestingly, some regions had strict rules about meat consumption, not just from the church, which designated fasting days and forbidden foods, but from local customs. In some towns, only the nobility could hunt game. If a peasant was caught with venison, they might lose more than dinner. Hands. Or worse. So people got creative. Hedgehogs were roasted, squirrels stewed. There are even records of songbirds being spitted and cooked whole, feathers and all. You suddenly remember the chicken the apprentice was plucking earlier looked suspiciously like a large crow. And then there's mock meat. Yes, it existed. Lent forced cooks to mimic meat with mixtures of ground nuts, breadcrumbs and spices shaped into sausages or patties. One famous medieval cookbook even offered a recipe for a vegetarian bacon using toasted oats and lard-like fat. Which really defeats the point, doesn't it? You ask the cook what his most prized meat is. He grins with a few remaining teeth and says, "Goat, if you can get it. Nothing better than goat with garlic and sour apples." You ask when he last had goat. He shrugs. 12 winters ago. So, not soon. There's a brief commotion outside. A rider from the manor delivering what appears to be a haunch of venison wrapped in linen. Everyone gathers around as it's unwrapped, revealing dark, lean meat streaked with fat. This is a gift. A rare token from the noble house up the hill. Or maybe they just didn't want to eat the leg. Either way, the excitement is real. A feast is coming. In the corner, a boy cleans out a small pot with vinegar and ash, basic medieval soap. He prepares it for rendering fat, which will be stored in clay pots and used sparingly through winter. Goose fat, pork drippings, beef tallow, these were culinary gold. They fried food, flavoured bread, healed cracked skin, and probably doubled as candle wax in a pinch. There's something raw and grounding about this process. You see the bird, the butcher, the bubbling broth and the bones. Nothing is hidden. No shrink wrap, no labels. Just the reality of what it takes to eat something that once walked around. It's sobering, and oddly respectful. Some historians still debate just how much meat medieval peasants ate. Was it once a week, once a month, or only at weddings and funerals? The truth likely varies, depending on location, wealth, and how many rabbits you could catch without being caught. Outside, the sun begins to slip, casting long shadows through the kitchen's smoke-smeared windows. The pot bubbles on, slowly turning bones and sinew into nourishment. You inhale deeply. There's still a trace of vinegar in the air, but beneath it now something richer. Warmth, memory, sustenance. You realize that in a world where meat was a gamble, its presence in the pot felt like a small miracle, and tonight, at least for a few lucky stomachs, the miracle would taste faintly of goose. You're jolted awake, not that you'd fully drifted off, by a sharp, salty smell wafting in from a wooden crate near the back of the kitchen. A lid creaks open, and suddenly the unmistakable aroma of fish floods the air. Not fresh fish, mind you. This scent is ancient, briny, fermented, and possibly plotting revenge. It's Friday, which means no meat. The church had its rules, many of them, and fasting days were taken seriously. No pork, no beef, not even the faintest whiff of mutton. But fish, that was allowed, encouraged even. So today, as on every Friday, the kitchen becomes a temple of scales, bones, and salt. The cook lifts out a salted herring, hard as a brick and glistening with white crystals. He slaps it on the chopping board like a man challenging it to a duel. 4 days in brine, he grunts, and still smells like the sea. Or something near it. Fish preservation was essential. Without access to the ocean or a local river, inland kitchens relied on salted, dried, or smoked fish brought in by cart and prayer. Stockfish, usually cod, was one of the most traded goods of the Middle Ages. Hung until it turned into something between driftwood and jerky, it had to be hammered before use. Yes, really. You literally had to beat it with a mallet just to soften it enough to cook. You're handed a piece. It splinters like pine bark. You chew cautiously, jaw working overtime. It's salty, it's chewy, it's not bad if you grew up eating driftwood soaked in seawater. In wealthier households, fish might be stewed with wine, herbs, or onions. But here, the approach is simpler. Boil, salt, repeat. And if you're lucky, a spoonful of mustard seed is thrown in, not because it helps the flavour, but because it makes your eyes water and distracts your taste buds. Next to the hearth, another pot simmers. This one smells stronger, funkier. You peer inside. It's full of small chunks of fermented fish, what the cook calls garam's ghost. Technically, garum was a Roman invention, a sauce made from fish innards left to ferment in the sun until it turned into a salty, brownish liquid. It vanished for a while after Rome fell, but versions of it crept back into medieval cuisine, especially in coastal regions. And this pot, it's something like that, strong enough to clear your sinuses, sharp enough to etch glass. You sit beside a barrel filled with eel, live, squirming, and definitely not amused. Eel was a favourite in many regions, easy to catch, easy to store, and surprisingly versatile. It could be roasted, boiled, fried, or baked into a pie, though calling it a pie might be generous. More like a series of unfortunate choices sealed in dough. One boy skewers a row of dried fish and sets them over the coals. The smoke curls upward, fragrant and oddly sweet. He grins, teeth blackened at the edges. Best smell in the world, he says proudly, as if daring you to disagree. You don't. The relationship between medieval cooks and fish was complicated. Fish was revered, especially during Lent or other holy days when meat was forbidden. But it was also a symbol of endurance, a sign of cleverness. To eat well without breaking church law? That took skill. In river towns, the diet was better. Fresh trout, carp, or pike could be caught daily. But for inland villagers, preservation was life. Salted herring, pickled perch, even smoked lamprey, a creature that looks like a nightmare and tastes like one too. Still, the church insisted fish was humble, spiritually pure. Which is ironic, considering the nobility often dined on lavish seafood platters, while peasants gnawed on dried cod so stiff you could use it as a fence post. Some historians argue that the heavy emphasis on fish helped drive trade and culinary innovation. Salt roads were mapped, smokehouses expanded, and fermentation, it became an art, albeit one that occasionally cleared an entire room. Your head leans back against the warm stone. The kitchen noise softens. Spoons clink. Fish bones crack. And someone hums an old tune about St. Peter, feeding a village with 3 herring and a miracle. You smile faintly, unsure if you're soothed by the lull of routine, or slightly delirious from the fumes of fermented eel. Either way, you're warm, fed, and, miraculously, still breathing. The morning light is softer now, slanting through the kitchen window and glinting off the shell of a single brown egg sitting in a straw-lined basket. It seems so small, so fragile, and yet in this world it might as well be gold. You're watching a young girl gently sort through the eggs her hens laid overnight. She turns each one in her hand like it might crack under her gaze. Some are still warm, others cold. All of them are precious. Chickens in the Middle Ages were not kept for meat, not unless they were old, sick, or had the misfortune of being too loud at the wrong time. No, they were kept for eggs, and even then, hens didn't lay year-round. Eggs were seasonal. Spring was the boom, when the days grew longer and the hens remembered they had jobs. But in the dead of winter, the egg basket might remain empty for weeks. That's why cooks had to be careful, strategic. Some eggs were eaten fresh. Others were hard-boiled and stored in ashes or brine to last a little longer. And if you broke one by accident, well, may the saints have mercy. Today's haul is modest. 7 eggs, 5 whole, 2 cracked but still usable. They'll be beaten with a sprig of parsley and stirred into hot broth to make something called egg drop pottage, a sort of medieval egg soup, if you squint hard and ignore the floating cabbage. You're handed a bowl. It's thin, warm, and oddly foamy. The egg threads have formed wispy ribbons like ghosts drifting through a cloudy sea. You take a sip. It's comforting, in a very humble, very chicken-adjacent way. Eggs weren't just food, they were symbols of rebirth, of seasonal change, and in some regions of good luck. On certain feast days, people would exchange decorated eggs, a tradition that still echoes in modern spring holidays. Of course, theirs weren't dipped in pastel dye. More likely, they were etched with wax, boiled with onion skins, or simply passed along with a nod of appreciation. You glance out the window and spot the hens, scratching the dirt in the courtyard. They look industrious, pecking and strutting like they own the place. And in some ways they do. These ladies are feeding a household. Their work matters. The apprentice strolls past carrying a basket of hay and a sly smile. Hen's hiding her eggs again, he mutters. Found 3 under the wash bin. It's a game, this. Hens laying in secret corners, humans playing scavenger hunt. Sometimes they were found, sometimes not. And every so often a forgotten egg would reappear with a dramatic pop and a smell that cleared the kitchen faster than fire. What's fascinating is that eggs, like meat, were governed by the calendar. On fast days they were forbidden, which meant cooks had to find substitutes, like almond milk, which wasn't milk at all but ground almonds mixed with water. For mock eggs, they might fill hollowed shells with spiced vegetable puree, trying to recreate the feel, if not the flavour. One noble household, according to rumour, once served an entire platter of fake eggs made from mashed fish and dyed crusts. No one was fooled, but everyone was too polite to say anything. That, or they were terrified of the cook. Some medieval recipes included egg thickening, especially in custards or sauces. But since precise temperature control didn't exist, cooks often curdled the whole thing and called it a texture. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it became scrambled eggs with ambition. You're shown a cracked egg being tested in a bowl of water. If it sinks, it's fresh. If it floats, it's suspect. You watch it bob lazily to the surface. The cook tosses it out the door without a word. The dog runs after it anyway. One elder woman speaks up as she grinds herbs beside the hearth. When I was a girl, she says, we fed eggs to the sick, just the yolks, whisked with wine, for strength. You ask if it worked. She shrugs. Sometimes they lived, sometimes they didn't. Medicine, medieval edition. There's a stillness now. The fire crackles. The hens cluck softly outside. The kitchen smells faintly of straw, hot broth, and patience. And you, sitting with your half-finished egg soup and warm wooden bowl, feel something close to peace. Because in this world, an egg is not just food, It's a moment, a season, a quiet kind of hope. The cheese cellar is darker than the root cellar, and somehow damper. You duck your head beneath the low arch as the cook leads you down narrow steps, holding a lantern that flickers against the stone. The air here is different, cooler, yes, but also rich, earthy, and slightly pungent, like something halfway between old socks and a mild dare. Welcome to the world of medieval dairy. Dairy was a delicate business. Milk couldn't be stored long. It turned fast, and not always in a pleasant direction. So the moment it was milked, usually by hand, usually at dawn, it had to be used. Some became fresh cheese. Some went into butter. The rest? That often became a mystery only the bravest would drink the next morning. You peer into the corner where rounds of cheese are stacked like ancient relics. Each one is slightly different in size, colour, and mood. Some are wrapped in cloth, others coated in ash or herbs. A few appear to be growing something, possibly penicillin, possibly personality. Cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't the neatly sliced, pasteurised kind. It was alive, often literally. Soft cheeses had to be eaten quickly. Harder ones were pressed, salted, and left to age in places like this, dark, damp, and mostly free of rats, mostly. A boy hands you a wedge. It's chalky, pale yellow, and smells faintly of wet hay. You nibble a corner. It's sharp, salty, and surprisingly decent. Somewhere between a crumbly goat cheese and a lesson in humility. You nod. The cook smiles proudly, then bites into a wheel that could double as a discus. Milk came from cows, goats, or sheep, depending on what you had. Cow's milk was most common, but goats were easier to keep and more forgiving. Their milk was often used for soft cheeses, or for making a medieval yogurt of sorts, soured, thickened, and eaten with bread. Or spooned straight from the pot if no one was watching. Butter, meanwhile, was a status symbol. Fresh, creamy, golden butter was rare. You needed time, strength, and a steady rhythm to churn it by hand. And if the weather was too hot, it melted before you finished. Too cold. It wouldn't come together at all. Butter making was an art and a gamble. But when it worked, it was glorious. Spread on fresh bread with a bit of honey, it was enough to make you believe in joy again. You're shown a churn, wooden, scarred, and sticky around the handle. 40 minutes, the cook grunts, pushing the plunger rhythmically. Sometimes more if the cow's moody. You ask what happens if the butter doesn't come? He shrugs. We drink the milk and try again tomorrow. And just like that, hope is repurposed. In lean times, people relied on sour milk, what we'd now call buttermilk or clabber. It could be added to porridge, baked into bread, or turned into soft curds. The flavour was tangy, the texture sometimes unsettling, but it was filling. And in a world where every calorie counted, that meant everything. There's a clay crock near the hearth filled with curdled milk and herbs. A woman stirs it with a wooden spoon, muttering about stomach sickness and cooling the blood. Dairy wasn't just food, it was medicine too, or at least something you hoped would make you feel better after eating too much fish. Some regions even drank fermented milk straight. Think kefir, but medieval and moodier. It bubbled slightly, had a sour punch, and was often mixed with garlic or mustard seed. Not exactly a smoothie, but it did the trick. Supposedly. The records from monasteries show that monks kept detailed logs of cheese aging, butter yields, and milk rotations. But even among scholars, debates persist. Were medieval cheeses closer to feta, or more like sharp cheddar? Did butter vary drastically between regions? And why, in so many cookbooks, are dairy measurements listed as enough to fill a ladle, or until it feels right? We may never know. You make your way back up to the main kitchen, hands still sticky with curds, head spinning from the mixture of milk and mystery. A slice of warm bread is waiting. Someone spreads a pat of butter so fresh it glistens, then hands it to you wordlessly. You bite in, and for just a moment everything else disappears. You're back at the prep table, which now trembles under the weight of several burlap sacks, each one filled with something that clinks, shifts, and gives off the unmistakable scent of dry earth and possibility. The sacks are untied and rolled down with the same reverence one might reserve for sacred texts. Inside, peas, beans, lentils, and more peas. So many peas. In the medieval kitchen, legumes weren't just ingredients. They were lifelines. They grew well in poor soil, kept forever when dried, and most importantly, filled the belly. If you were lucky enough to have meat or eggs, great. But most days it was beans. Boiled beans. Mashed beans. Beans in porridge. Beans in bread. Beans as stuffing. There was even something that loosely resembled hummus, though calling it that would definitely get you laughed out of the manor. You reach into one of the sacks and let a handful of dried fava beans run through your fingers. They're smooth, slightly dusty, and utterly unassuming. But these little things carried people through harsh winters, bad harvests, and Lenten fasts. A pot bubbles gently nearby. The cook removes the lid, revealing a mush of split peas, onions, and a hunk of stale bread melting into the mixture. It's thick, green, smells faintly of old socks. But when he ladles some into your bowl and nods for you to try it, you do. It's better than expected, salty, earthy. The texture is glue adjacent, but it warms your stomach instantly. A couple spoonfuls in, you understand why people kept coming back to this dish for centuries. It's humble, yes, but it sustains. Legumes were also crucial during periods of fasting, when meat, eggs, and dairy were off the menu. They offered protein, sort of. At least enough to keep muscles moving and minds foggy, but functional. And when combined with grains, they actually provided a reasonably complete set of amino acids, though no one at the time would have known what amino acids were. They just knew that porridge plus peas made them less likely to faint in the fields. You overhear two women gossiping over a pot of broad beans. One complains about her neighbour's tendency to undersalt everything. The other nods knowingly and sprinkles in a pinch of dried sage. For flavour and for wind, she says. You ask what she means. She grins, helps with the rumbling. You get it, bean jokes are timeless. And yes, flatulence was a very real part of the medieval dining experience. Some sources even describe it as musical. Not all kitchens had doors, but they all had ventilation. There's a cloth bundle near the hearth, tied tight and sitting in a shallow pot. It's bean pudding, someone explains. Basically mashed lentils, breadcrumbs, onion, herbs, and sometimes dried fruit, steamed until solid. You slice it like cake, eat it like penance. You try a piece, it's dense, slightly sweet, has the texture of damp wool. But again, it's not about pleasure, it's about calories. And this little grey loaf is packed with them. Some households kept a separate sack of emergency peas, not for famine exactly, but for when everything else ran out. These were the peas at the bottom of the barrel, discoloured, chipped, dusty. They'd be rinsed, soaked overnight, and thrown into whatever was cooking. They didn't add much flavour, but they gave the illusion of fullness, and in times of hardship, illusion could mean survival. Historians still argue over just how often peasants ate beans compared to grains. In some areas they were daily fare, in others more of a fallback. What's clear is that people developed dozens of ways to cook them. Roasted, baked into pies, mashed with vinegar, even stuffed into dumpling-like wrappers made from oat flour. You glance around the kitchen, now filled with the quiet steam of legume life. The air is soft, heavy, and vaguely sulphurous. No one seems to mind. The youngest boy spoons up a ladle of lentil mash and grins like he's won a prize. You finish your bowl in silence, the last bit sticking stubbornly to the spoon. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't sizzle, but it stays with you. The meal, and later the after effects. The miller's boy arrives just past mid-morning, a dust-covered blur dragging 2 sacks of grain behind him like defeated soldiers. He drops them in the corner with a grunt, tips his cap and vanishes, probably off to find a place to nap, or at least sit down without being asked to scrub something. You approach the sacks. One's filled with coarse barley. The other? Oats. Not the tidy rolled kind you see in breakfast ads, but the raw, husk-clinging stuff that looks like it was collected by hand, because it probably was. Grain was the heartbeat of the medieval diet. Not meat, not fish, grain. You could turn it into bread, porridge, gruel, even drink. But above all, it was cheap, filling, and endlessly versatile. Which is good, because it was also endlessly repetitive. The cook pours a scoop of barley into a pot already sweating on the hearth. The water's cloudy with starch, and a thin wooden spoon leans precariously against the rim. As it simmers, the barley thickens, slowly, stubbornly. You can already see it becoming what it always becomes, gruel. Let's talk about gruel. Not glamorous, not spicy, not celebratory. Just wet grain. Think oatmeal, but more defensive in texture. Gruel was eaten by peasants, monks, soldiers, and anyone trying to survive on less than a loaf a day. It could be sweetened with honey, if you had any, or thinned with water when times were hard, which meant always. You're handed a bowl. It steams gently. A few grains of salt glisten on top like treasure. You lift the spoon, taste it. It's bland, like wet paper with ambition, but somehow comforting. Filling. Heavy, in a you probably won't faint before mid-afternoon kind of way. Bread, on the other hand, had its own hierarchy. Poor families often ate coarse rye or barley loaves, dense as bricks and dark as the mill floor. The nobility, white bread made from fine wheat flour, milled smooth and clean. In some cases so clean that it was sifted through cloth to remove any trace of bran, or flavour. But hey, status is status. You glance over to where someone's pounding dough on a battered board. The sound is dull and rhythmic. The dough isn't elastic, it's firm, cracking slightly around the edges. They'll bake it in the communal oven later today, marked with a carved family symbol so no one walks off with the wrong loaf. Bread theft wasn't just rude, it was criminal. There's a large round loaf on the table now, already baked and cooled. You tap it, it thuds like a helmet. This is trench bread, meant to last a week, or two, maybe longer. You ask what's in it. The cook shrugs. Barley, ground peas, oat flour, maybe some dried nettle. You ask how it tastes. Best when dipped, which means don't chew it raw unless you've got strong teeth and a good dentist, neither of which exist. In lean seasons, people stretched flour with whatever they had. Dried beans, acorns, even tree bark. Yes, bark. The inner layer was dried, ground into powder, and mixed with what little grain was left. The result? Famine bread. Bitter, dense, possibly digestible. But it kept people from starving, technically. One of the boys offers you a corner crust of bread. You bite in carefully. It's chewy, nutty, with an occasional crunch that might be gravel. You smile politely and hope your fillings survive. When flour was too scarce for real loaves, people made flatbreads or cakes from mashed grain and water. Baked directly on hot stones, these could be ready in minutes. Flavour wasn't the point, survival was. Even trenchers, the thick slabs of bread used as edible plates, were repurposed. After absorbing broth and meat drippings, they might be eaten at the end of a meal or passed down the social ladder. From lord to squire to servant to dog, to no one if it got too soggy. Some historians debate whether these breads were nutritious enough to sustain long-term health. The answer, probably not. But they filled the stomach. And in a world where that alone was a victory, no one asked for sourdough starters or a gluten-free option. You sit back, cradling the half-eaten crust. The kitchen buzzes with quiet work. Someone stokes the fire. Someone else washes the grain sack with vinegar to keep the mice at bay. And outside, in the dusty field beyond the wall, another cart rattles its way toward the door. More grain, more labour, more porridge tomorrow. You spot a basket on the windowsill, green and fragrant, overflowing with clippings. Not vegetables, not roots, herbs, dozens of them, bundled, braided, or simply tossed together like someone tried gardening with both hands and no plan. A girl sits beside the basket, sorting stems by smell and feel. She sniffs each one, nods, then drops it into a clay jar or onto a drying rack above the hearth. Basil, sage, thyme, mugwort, pennyroyal, names that sound half culinary, half magic. And in a way they were both. Herbs in the medieval kitchen weren't just about flavour. They were medicine, seasoning, pest repellents, love spells, and sometimes accidental poison. You pick up a sprig and bring it to your nose. It's sharp and citrusy, almost peppery. She tells you it's tansy, used to flavour cakes during Lent, and possibly to expel worms. You blink. She shrugs. Helps with stomach wind too. You're beginning to realise most medieval ingredients had multiple jobs, and only some of them were culinary. The cook crushes rosemary between his fingers and drops it into a pot of lentils. A sharp, piney scent fills the air. He adds a few cloves of garlic, a pinch of sage, and then, casually, a single bay leaf, like it's a secret handshake. He grins. Just one, or you'll ruin it. Herbs were grown in small kitchen gardens, or gathered from the wild. Monasteries had detailed herbals, manuscripts listing plants and their uses, from curing coughs to conjuring dreams. In poor homes, it was more about tradition and memory. You knew what your grandmother used and what your neighbour used, and what your neighbour shouldn't have used, judging by her rash. And still, mistakes happened. That's why some families refused to use hemlock, even though it looked like parsley. Others avoided foxglove, though it made hearts beat stronger. It was a fine line, sometimes a deadly one. There's an iron pot hanging over the fire now. It's filled with bean stew, thickened with barley, and dotted with something green. You taste it. It's richer, somehow. Brighter. The herbs lift everything, covering the bitterness, masking the salt, even distracting from the slightly chewy texture of a poorly washed lentil. You make a mental note. Herbs are medieval seasoning, distraction, and disguise. Some dishes used herbs extravagantly. Green sauces were popular in wealthier homes. Thick blends of parsley, sorrel, vinegar, and sometimes wine pounded with stale bread. These sauces were spooned over cold meat or used to dunk trenchers. One noble banquet even featured a sauce forestière, made entirely from foraged greens and garlic. You ask the girl which herb is her favourite. She holds up a limp sprig of mint. It grows fast, she says. Tastes clean. You agree. Mint appears everywhere, from stews to tooth powders. It was crushed into wine, steeped in baths, and laid beneath pillows to ward off nightmares. But not all herbs were friendly. Some had a darker side. Monkshood, belladonna, henbane. These plants weren't allowed in most kitchens, but their presence in herbals suggests someone, somewhere, was curious. Whether for healing or harm, well, historians are still debating that. You wander to the doorway, where bundles of dried herbs hang like wind chimes that gave up on making noise. They sway gently in the breeze. Lavender, chamomile, marjoram. A soft scent drifts through the room, calming. You feel your shoulders drop, your chest lighten. In medieval kitchens, herbs weren't measured in tablespoons or grams. They were pinched, plucked, whispered. Recipes said things like, a handful of goodly green, or a sprig no longer than your thumb. Cooking was memory, instinct, and occasionally, luck. Back at the table, someone sneezes violently after grinding pepper and mustard seed in a mortar. The girl laughs. That's how you know it's working. You sit back and take another spoonful of herb-laced stew. The flavours have deepened. The warmth lingers. And somewhere, in the edge of your thoughts, you wonder if the mint really does keep bad dreams away. The dining area has been cleared. Benches wiped with damp cloths and straw, and in the centre of the long wooden table, a small wooden box is opened with the kind of care usually reserved for relics or secrets. Inside, tiny wrinkled treasures, peppercorns, mustard seeds, cloves, cinnamon bark, a few threads of saffron glinting like stolen sunlight. You blink. Spices. It feels out of place here, in a kitchen where yesterday's bread is repurposed as today's plate, and where onions double as medicine. But make no mistake, spices were very much part of the medieval world. They just didn't belong to everyone. The cook, almost reverently, pinches a few grains of black pepper and sprinkles them over a roast turnip. Not because turnip deserves it, but because someone important is visiting. And a little pepper makes anything seem intentional. Imported from distant lands, spices were among the most expensive commodities of the age. Cloves from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India. Saffron, even when grown closer to home, required hand harvesting from thousands of crocus flowers. A pound of the good stuff could be worth more than a month's wages. So how did a peasant kitchen like this get any? The answer, rarely and sparingly. Maybe a bit was gifted, maybe traded, maybe even stolen, though no one would admit it. A pinch could stretch across several meals, mostly in noble houses. But in rare moments when the stars aligned, or when the manor's cook was feeling generous, peasants caught a glimpse of that distant luxury. You're handed a piece of honeyed bread dusted with a curious spice blend, a little cinnamon, a lot of mystery. You bite in. It's warm, sweet, oddly complex. You close your eyes. It tastes like the memory of something better. In higher circles, spice blends were carefully crafted. Powder douce for sweet dishes, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, sugar. Powder fort for savoury, pepper, clove, mustard, maybe galangal. These mixes were stored in tiny containers, passed like treasure chests, used by cooks who'd sworn oaths to never waste a single grain. Of course, not everyone used spices properly. There are tales of cooks overloading soups with pepper to impress guests, or mask the taste of bad meat. Some even added saffron to dishes solely for its colour. Yellow food was considered beautiful. Deliciousness was sometimes secondary. You ask one of the women near the hearth if she's ever tasted saffron. She grins. Once, at a wedding, the rice was gold, tasted like sunshine and laundry. You pause. Laundry? She shrugs. Fancy laundry. You look down at a mortar and pestle, where mustard seeds are being crushed with vinegar. The resulting paste is sharp, nose-clearing, and oddly familiar. Medieval mustard wasn't the neon stuff of modern sandwiches. It was dark, gritty, and unrefined. But it brought life to cold meat, dried fish, and even lentil mash. It was the working man's wasabi. There's debate among historians about just how much spice actually reached common kitchens. Some believe it was rare to non-existent. Others point to estate records showing annual distributions of pepper to servants. Either way, when it did appear, it mattered. Meals were talked about, remembered, maybe even exaggerated in later retellings. Back at the table, a bowl of spiced wine is passed around. Not wine as you know it, but hippocras, a medieval concoction made by warming red wine with sugar, cinnamon, and ginger. It's a feast day drink, heady and sweet. You sip it slowly, the spices warming your mouth and belly in equal measure. The cook tucks the spice box away when he thinks no one's looking, sliding it beneath the bread bin. Out of sight. Protected. As if it contains not ingredients but incantations. And in a way, it does. Because in this age, a single pinch of spice could turn a meal into memory. Could shift a moment from survival into celebration. And for tonight, just tonight, you were allowed to taste it. It's almost sundown now, and the kitchen has entered a strange sort of rhythm. Not frantic, not calm, but poised. Like the air is waiting for something. And then you hear it, the bell from the village church tower. A long solemn toll. The cook straightens. The apprentices stop what they're doing. It's not the sound of danger, it's the sound of fasting. Tomorrow is a holy day. You look around and see preparations shifting. No more butter, no eggs, no meat. Tomorrow's meals will be meatless, milkless, and mostly flavourless, unless someone gets clever. The medieval calendar wasn't just divided by seasons, it was ruled by feasts and fasts. The church dictated dozens of days throughout the year when animal products were forbidden. Lent alone lasted 40 days, not counting Sundays. Add in saints' days, vigil fasts, and Fridays, and you'd spend nearly half the year in culinary abstinence. You'd think people would be resentful, but instead they got creative. The cook pulls a pot from the hearth and pours in a thick puree of almonds and water. You watch as he stirs it gently, straining the mixture through cloth. Almond milk, he says. Rich man's milk. It was the go-to dairy substitute during fasts, white, nutty, and luxurious if you could afford it. Of course, most peasants didn't have almonds, so they made oat milk, pea milk, or sometimes no milk at all. Fasting was less about substitutions and more about simplification. Bread, beans, onions, maybe fish if available, and a lot of prayer. You're handed a small tart made with dried fruits, boiled in wine and thickened with breadcrumbs. It's dense, chewy, spiced with ginger and cloves. For the vigil, the girl says. No butter in the crust. It still tastes indulgent somehow, sweet enough to feel like cheating. During feasts, those blessed opposite days, everything reversed. The tables groaned with food, meat pies, custards, roasted birds, glazed fruits. The same kitchen that had scrimped and rationed the day before became a theatre of excess. The line between penance and party was razor thin, and dictated not by hunger, but by the calendar. It's a strange logic. Today eggs are sinful, tomorrow they're sacred. Today you eat barley bread and onion broth, tomorrow there's lamb and cherry sauce. But the pattern creates its own rhythm. The hunger makes the feast sweeter. The feast, in turn, justifies the hunger. One of the boys is grinding something in a mortar, roasted peas, from the smell. He's shaping them into little cakes to fry in oil. "Mock meat," he says proudly. "Looks like pork." You glance at the shapeless grey blobs and nod with exaggerated enthusiasm. He beams. Mock meats were a whole genre unto themselves. Not just substitutes, but illusions. Boiled wheat gluten shaped into fish. Dried figs pressed to look like liver. Lentils formed into patties and stuck with parsley sprigs to resemble bones. It was medieval food cosplay, with just enough effort to make you forget what you were missing. Not everyone approved. Some clergy argued that disguising food in this way defeated the spirit of fasting. Others saw it as harmless play, a way to obey the rules without hating every bite. Historians still debate how seriously the church took these culinary sleights of hand, and whether the cooks did them with reverence or with a wink. Outside, a few early stars prick the sky. Inside, the final pot of the evening simmers. Cabbage, onion, and vinegar. No fat, no meat, no guilt. The kind of humble stew that fills the belly and softens the conscience. You dip a heel of bread into it and chew slowly. It's sour, a little smoky, honest. There's something beautiful about it all. The ebb and flow of feast and fast, indulgence and restraint. A calendar not marked by meetings or deadlines, but by flavour. And as the candles are lit and the fire begins to fade, you realise that in this world, timing wasn't just everything. It was taste itself. You're wiping your fingers on a scrap of linen when a deep clatter comes from the other room, followed by a triumphant laugh and someone shouting, "Mind the crust!" The scent that follows is unmistakable. Hot flour, bubbling fat, and something rich hidden beneath pastry. You stand and follow your nose. On the table now is a sight to behold, a pie. But not the golden flaky kind you might be dreaming of. This crust is thick, pale, almost clay-like. It's not there for flavour, it's there for structure. A medieval pie crust, also called a coffin, wasn't always meant to be eaten. It was a container, a shell, an edible baking dish. In theory. The cook is slicing into it with a broad, blunt blade. The crust cracks like dried mud, revealing a filling of meat, herbs, and dark gravy, still steaming. Everyone leans in. This is dinner and spectacle. You're offered a slice, but warned, don't eat the sides unless you're desperate. You take a cautious bite of the filling instead. It's warm, savoury, with a surprising note of nutmeg. Somehow, this unlikely package contains both the bare essentials and a hint of celebration. Not all pies were meat-filled. Some carried fish, others fruit. The rarest kind held eggs, leeks, or soft cheese, especially on feast days. And there were even records of pies designed for pageantry, filled with live birds or frogs that leapt out when the lid was lifted, a trick mostly reserved for nobility or weddings. You glance at your pie slice, relieved nothing is moving. Sweet pastries existed too, but rarely in kitchens like this one. Fruit tarts, custard flans, and fritters dusted with sugar were treats for the manor house, not the village bench, and sugar itself, a luxury beyond reach. When peasants wanted sweet, they turned to honey, dried fruit, or root vegetables with a natural mellow flavour, like parsnips boiled until soft, then mashed with milk. You're handed another slice of something vaguely pastry adjacent. It's darker, filled with mashed peas and a hint of onion. Prison pie, someone calls it. Not because it's served in jail, but because it tastes like punishment. You take a bite anyway. It's dense, bland, a little chewy, but warm. And that's something. In fact, pies had another unexpected use, practical preservation. Sealed under layers of hardened pastry and sometimes fat, fillings could last days or even weeks. A cooked pie might be stored in a cool cellar and reheated later. The crust in these cases acted like Tupperware, really, really chewy Tupperware. You ask about dessert. A few people chuckle. Someone slides over a rough hand pie filled with stewed apples and raisins. The pastry is thick and uneven, the filling tart with a hint of cinnamon. You take a bite. It's not perfect, but it's enough to count as sweet. And in a world of pottage and pickles, that's victory. Some households made apple pasties with lard-based crusts, or plum tart sweetened with boiled-down grape must. Others served dried figs rolled in flour and fried in oil. Still others made nothing at all, because there was no time, or no ingredients, or no reason beyond simply being too tired. You watch now as the scraps of pie crust are gathered. Some go to the pigs, others to the dogs, and one chunk is saved, dried, and tucked into a pouch. For the road, someone says. Even the inedible had a use. There's something poetic about it, this food wrapped in food, this meal within a meal. Pies were practicality wrapped in performance, both sustenance and story. And as the table is cleared and the crumbs brushed aside, you sit back, full in a way that has nothing to do with indulgence, and everything to do with enough. The hearth has dimmed now, coals glowing like tired embers in the belly of a beast. Most of the kitchen has gone quiet. Pots scraped clean, bowls stacked, knives rinsed and left to dry on the edge of the table. But there's one more thing the cook wants to show you before sleep takes hold. He beckons you toward a small shelf, nearly hidden behind a hanging cloth. On it lies a thick, weather-stained book. The leather is cracked, the corners frayed, and the clasp barely holds together. When he opens it, the pages whisper like old parchment sighing awake. The ink is faded, the handwriting uneven. This is not a cookbook. It is a spellbook of suppers, a record of memory disguised as recipes. Take this, he says, pointing at a line halfway down the page. The text reads, "To make a goose with blood of ox and honey of comb, bake till the bones are hollow as reeds, and serve with rosemary for the heart." You raise an eyebrow. He chuckles. Bit dramatic, that one. The truth is, medieval cookbooks were part instruction, part puzzle, and part performance. Most people didn't use them, not because they couldn't read, though many couldn't, but because cooking was an oral craft. You learned by watching, doing, and being burned occasionally in the process. These books were written for stewards and noble kitchens, and yet somehow fragments of their knowledge trickled down into villages. A cook might hear about a technique second-hand, scribble it in the margins of a prayer book, or invent a version of it with whatever was lying around. Like food itself, knowledge was passed hand to hand, shaped by necessity. You flip through a few more pages. Some recipes are little more than riddles. Make a tart of marrow and sweet rain. Others are shockingly blunt. Boil the fish, eat it warm, waste none. One is scrawled in Latin, then hastily translated into French and then into what might be English, but sounds like someone whispering through a mouthful of flour. And yet, among the oddities, there's poetry. A line reads, "To thicken the broth, stir widdershins." That is counterclockwise. A small superstition, perhaps, or maybe just a reminder that in the kitchen, everything turns. Some recipes have no measurements at all, just vague gestures. Add herbs until the pot breathes, or season till the air is full. You realize these weren't just instructions, they were feelings, memories, a way to carry someone's voice across generations. You close the book gently and glance around the kitchen one last time. The room is bathed in flickering candlelight, and it feels different now, less like a workspace, more like a chapel. The table still holds traces of flour. A single clove sits forgotten in a dish. The smell of herbs lingers like a lullaby. The kind you can't quite hum, but always recognize. The cook yawns and stretches. "That's it then," he says. "Until morning." He presses the book closed, not with reverence, but with the gentle finality of a door being latched for the night. And you, full of lentils and ash-crusted pies and honey-thick wine, find your eyelids heavy. Not with sleep alone, but with centuries, with the weight of meals made and meals forgotten, of mouths fed, of spoons stirred, of laughter over burned bread and sighs over spoiled milk. It's quiet now, just the crackle of the last ember. a gentle hum of night. And so we drift into that silence together, where stews no longer bubble and pies no longer steam, where trenchers soften in memory and onions become dreams, where old recipes whisper in the dark and you sleep among them. End of script. Sweet dreams.